On June 24, 1944, as American forces pressed inland on Saipan, a small group of Japanese women moved with a retreating medical detachment toward caves already crowded with wounded and civilians. Among them were a field nurse trained in basic surgery, a records clerk who had never fired a weapon, and two young women attached to a signals unit as typists. None had been told what would happen if the front collapsed. What they had been told, repeatedly and with certainty, was what awaited them if Americans found them alive. Imperial training manuals, lectures, and newspapers had been consistent. American soldiers were described as violent, uncontrolled, and driven by base urges. Surrender, especially for women, was framed as a fate worse than death. Nurses were instructed to poison themselves if capture became unavoidable. Civilian auxiliaries were warned that mercy would not be offered. The women on Saipan had absorbed this message long before the shells began falling closer, long before the wounded outnumbered the bandages. As the Japanese defense disintegrated, order gave way to fragmentation. Field hospitals were abandoned. Communications failed. Units dissolved into groups, moving independently, carrying what they could and destroying what they could not. The nurse had already seen men shot for suggesting surrender. The clerk had copied orders calling death honorable and capture shameful. By the time American patrols reached the outskirts of the caves, fear had become operational doctrine. On July 7th, after a final mass attack failed, American units began clearing the remaining pockets of resistance. Civilians and non-combatants emerged first, many waving scraps of cloth. Some jumped rather than be taken. Others hesitated at the edge, watching what happened to those who stepped forward. The women remained inside, listening to unfamiliar voices through interpreters calling for surrender. The words sounded procedural, almost calm. That calm was interpreted as deception. When a nurse was wounded by shrapnel, the group could no longer move. Blood loss made delay dangerous. The clerk, shaking, stepped outside first. She expected immediate violence. Instead, she was ordered to sit, searched quickly, and moved aside. A medic approached the nurse without raising his voice. A blanket was placed over her shoulders. No one shouted. No one struck her. The absence of what had been promised was as shocking as any assault might have been. Processing took place away from the front. Names were taken where possible. Ages were estimated. The women were separated from captured soldiers and escorted to a temporary holding area. They were given water and told to wait. The nurse was treated for her wound. The typists were issued clothing not marked by rank. None of this aligned with expectation. The women watched every movement, waiting for the moment the pretense would end. Their fear did not vanish. It adjusted. Each act of restraint forced a recalculation. If violence was coming, it was delayed. If humiliation was planned, it was postponed. Hours passed. Then night. Guards rotated. Food arrived, plain and measured. The clerk noticed rules being followed. Orders were repeated. Behavior appeared monitored. This did not feel accidental. Similar scenes unfolded elsewhere. On Okinawa, Japanese nurses captured near Shuri Castle reported the same disorientation. On Leyte, civilian auxiliaries taken during mop-up operations described expecting immediate abuse and receiving structured custody instead. In post-war interviews, many women recalled the same first realization. Whatever Americans were, they were not acting without instruction. The women spoke little at first. Silence felt safer than interpretation. But questions formed anyway. Why had no one touched them? Why had the wounded been treated first? Why were guards corrected by superiors when they spoke too harshly? These questions did not lead to gratitude. They led to confusion. Confusion was dangerous because it undermined certainty. The central conflict took shape inside that uncertainty. Everything the women had been taught defined American soldiers as men without control. Control, in Japanese military culture, was associated with honor. The behavior they were witnessing forced a contradiction. If the enemy possessed restraint, then the foundation of the fear they carried was unstable. Admitting that instability felt like betrayal. One woman, older than the others, articulated it quietly. She had served in China before being reassigned. She had seen brutality at close range. Watching an American officer reprimand a guard for unnecessary force, she said, "They act like men who answer to rules." The phrase was not praise. It was an observation that cut against years of instruction. The group did not resolve this thought. They carried it forward, unresolved and unsettling. The war that had defined Americans as monsters had ended for them not with an act of cruelty, but with a set of procedures. As they waited for transfer inland, the women understood that survival would now require a different courage. The courage to live with evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught to fear. That evidence did not bring relief. It sharpened tension. The women measured every interaction for signs of reversal. They noticed the way guards kept distance, the way instructions were relayed through interpreters, the way records were kept. The clerk watched a ledger filled with dates and locations, noting that captivity was being documented, not improvised. Documentation suggested accountability. Accountability suggested limits. Rumors circulated among prisoners as they were consolidated. Some spoke of executions elsewhere. Others claimed kindness was temporary. The nurse listened and said nothing. Her wound had been cleaned and bandaged with care that mirrored training she recognized. The tools were unfamiliar, but the method was sound. That recognition unsettled her more than pain. It suggested a shared professional standard across enemy lines. Transport inland followed within days. The women were moved by truck under guard, passing ruined positions and abandoned equipment. No one celebrated. No one threatened. The silence of the guards was different from the silence of fear. It was deliberate, watchful, restrained. The typists tried to reconcile this with the lectures they had memorized. They could not. At a temporary compound, rules were posted. Times were set. Lines were formed. The women were told what would happen next, not in comforting language, but in plain terms. Uncertainty narrowed. With it, fear changed shape. It became anticipation rather than panic. Anticipation was harder to endure because it required attention. That night, the older woman spoke again. She did not raise her voice. She said that men who were truly dangerous did not need permission. These men asked for it. The others did not answer. Agreement felt risky. Disagreement felt dishonest. The war had demanded obedience. Captivity demanded observation. By morning, the women understood that the conflict they faced was not only with the enemy before them, but with the doctrine behind them. They had crossed a line they could not retreat from. What followed would test whether restraint would hold, whether rules would endure, and whether the word they were beginning to form, carefully and quietly, would survive the days ahead. As they were counted again at dawn, the clerk realized the fear she carried had changed owners. It no longer belonged to the enemy she faced, but to the certainty she had lost, and the judgment she would soon have to make when orders finally collided ahead. The women entered American custody under rules that had been written long before they were captured. Those rules did not promise comfort, but they prescribed limits. From the first day after transfer inland, the women learned that nearly every action around them followed an order, a checklist, or a procedure. This was not presented as kindness. It was presented as routine. They were registered individually. Names were taken when possible, phonetic spellings written down with care. Ages were estimated. Occupations were recorded. Each woman was issued basic clothing marked for prisoners, sized poorly, but clean. The clerk noticed that nothing about the process felt improvised. A man with a clipboard checked each entry, then checked it again. When one guard spoke too sharply, another corrected him without lowering his voice. Authority, the women observed, did not require anger. The nurse was taken to a medical tent set apart from the holding area. Treatment followed a sequence she recognized. Examination, cleaning, bandaging, notation. The instruments were different from those she had used, but the discipline was familiar. A medic explained what he was doing through an interpreter, not to reassure her, but to ensure compliance. Pain was addressed because untreated pain slowed recovery. The logic was clinical, not emotional. That distinction mattered. The typists were assigned to a separate enclosure with other women. Guards were posted at a distance. Instructions were delivered at set times. Water was distributed on schedule. Food arrived in measured portions. The meals were not generous, but they were consistent. Consistency reduced chaos. Chaos, the women understood, was where fear thrived. Each morning began with a count. Each evening ended with another. The women learned quickly that the count mattered. When one woman was slow to respond, the entire process stopped until she was found. The guards did not shout. They waited. Waiting carried weight. It communicated that the system required completion, not speed. Rumors circulated, as they always do among prisoners. Some claimed women elsewhere had been mistreated. Others said the Americans were gathering information before punishment. The women tested these rumors against what they could see. Days passed. Nothing changed. The guards rotated. Orders were followed. Behavior remained contained. The older woman, who had seen occupation forces in China, watched closely. She had learned to measure danger by impulse. Impulse was absent here. Even when a guard was clearly frustrated, he stepped back rather than forward. Once, when a soldier lingered too long near the women's enclosure, an officer intervened and reassigned him. The action was brief and public. The message was unmistakable. The clerk began to understand that protection, in this place, did not come from sympathy. It came from supervision. Every soldier appeared accountable to someone else. That accountability shaped conduct more reliably than goodwill. This realization unsettled her. She had been taught that enemy soldiers acted on instinct. Instinct had not been her experience so far. The nurse noticed another detail. Medical treatment did not vary by rank or attitude. A wounded woman who had shouted earlier received the same care as one who had remained silent. There was no reward for submission, no punishment for fear. Treatment followed condition. This was not mercy as she understood it. It was standardization. As days turned into weeks, the women were moved again, farther from the front. Transport followed procedure. Vehicles were searched. Routes were logged. At each stop, counts were repeated. The typists memorized the rhythm of it. Count, move, wait, count again. Predictability replaced dread. Predictability was dangerous to belief. The central conflict sharpened. Everything the women had been taught framed captivity as immediate violation. Yet violation did not come. Instead, captivity functioned as a controlled environment with defined boundaries. The absence of brutality forced a choice. Either this was a temporary deception, or the doctrine they had trusted was flawed. Holding both possibilities at once strained them. The older woman spoke less now. Observation had replaced commentary. She watched how guards avoided unnecessary contact, how interpreters were used even for simple commands, how complaints were recorded rather than dismissed. Once, when a woman refused to eat, a medic was called instead of a guard. The response treated refusal as a problem to be solved, not defiance to be crushed. That distinction echoed uncomfortably. In the Japanese system the women knew, refusal invited force. Here, force seemed reserved for preventing disorder, not enforcing obedience. Obedience was assumed through structure. Structure was maintained through oversight. The women had not been taught to expect this. At night, conversations were cautious. No one spoke of admiration. That word felt dangerous. But terms like order and rules surfaced repeatedly. The typists compared notes, reconstructing patterns. Meals at the same time. Inspections on schedule. Discipline applied consistently. The nurse pointed out that consistency required effort. Effort suggested intention. One afternoon, an incident tested that intention. A new guard, young and visibly nervous, raised his voice during a count. The women froze. The older woman prepared herself for escalation. Instead, an officer intervened, removed the guard, and completed the count himself. The correction was immediate. No explanation was offered. None was needed. That moment lingered. It was not dramatic. It was procedural, yet carried weight. The women understood that what restrained the guard was not personal virtue, but a system that did not tolerate deviation. This realization shifted the emotional balance. Fear no longer pointed outward alone. It began to turn inward toward the beliefs they carried. The nurse wrote later that this was the moment she stopped waiting for violence and started waiting for meaning. If the enemy was governed by rules, then surrender had not delivered them into chaos. It had placed them inside a framework they had never been taught to imagine. By the time word spread that the war's end was approaching, the women felt suspended between two certainties. One was the doctrine they had inherited, which insisted their fate must still turn cruel. The other was the lived experience of weeks under custody that contradicted it. Neither could be discarded easily. On the night before their next transfer, the older woman finally spoke again. She said that men who could restrain others could also restrain themselves. She did not say whether that made them good or bad. She said only that it made them dangerous in a different way. The women listened, aware that the real test of what they were witnessing had not yet arrived, and that restraint, once proven, would soon demand a judgment none of them were ready to make. The shift did not happen all at once. It emerged in fragments, shaped by repetition rather than revelation. By the time the women were settled into longer-term custody, the shock of capture had dulled, replaced by an alert stillness. They were no longer bracing for the first blow. They were watching for the pattern beneath the surface. The conversations began cautiously, late at night or during moments when guards were distant. No one spoke in absolutes. The nurse asked whether others had noticed how orders were enforced. The clerk answered that enforcement seemed aimed at soldiers, not prisoners. The typist compared notes, reconstructing the sequence of each day. Their language remained careful, but the subject had changed. They were no longer discussing fear alone. They were discussing behavior. What troubled them most was not what had happened, but what had not. No threats had followed defiance. No punishment had followed tears. When rules were broken, consequences landed on the men wearing uniforms, not on the women waiting behind wire. This inversion contradicted everything they understood about power. Power, as they had known it, flowed downward without restraint. The older woman listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was precise. She reminded them that discipline was not the same as kindness. She had seen disciplined men commit atrocities under orders. The women accepted this. They were not searching for virtue. They were measuring control. Control appeared again and again. A guard stopped another from shouting. An officer corrected a mistake without humiliation. An interpreter was called instead of a threat being issued. None of this felt dramatic. That was the problem. The absence of drama forced interpretation. One evening, the nurse described a moment from the medical tent. A wounded male prisoner had resisted treatment, thrashing and shouting. The medic stepped back, waited, then tried again with explanation. No one struck the man. No one restrained him until it was necessary. When restraint came, it was measured. The nurse said she had seen wounded Japanese soldiers beaten for less. No one responded immediately. The comparison hung between them. The clerk finally spoke the phrase aloud. She did not raise her voice. She said it as if testing its weight. She said that the Americans behaved like men who govern themselves. The word she used translated imperfectly, but its meaning was clear. It did not imply affection. It implied restraint backed by authority. The typists exchanged looks. One of them nodded once, sharply, as if agreeing to a fact she did not want. The older woman did not object. She clarified. She said that real men, as she understood the term, were those who could act without losing command of themselves. She said this quality was rare in war. She said it was rarer still to see it enforced. They did not repeat the phrase publicly. It remained confined to their circle. Speaking it outside felt dangerous. It implied a judgment not sanctioned by the doctrine they had lived under. That doctrine had promised that American soldiers were driven by impulse and cruelty. The women had built their fear around that promise. Now they were dismantling it piece by piece. This dismantling did not bring comfort. It brought unease. If the enemy was not what they had been told, then what else had been misrepresented? The question extended beyond captivity. It reached back into everything they had accepted without question. The women understood that admitting this would change them permanently. They continued to observe. They watched how complaints were handled, how mistakes were logged, how guards rotated. They noted that familiarity was discouraged. Distance was maintained. This was not friendliness. It was separation enforced for a reason. The reason, they suspected, was to prevent abuse before it began. The older woman shared an observation from China. She said that the most dangerous men she had known were those who acted without oversight. She said oversight changed behavior, even when intentions did not. The Americans, she concluded, lived inside oversight. This made them predictable. Predictability reduced fear. The nurse struggled with this conclusion. She had lost colleagues to American bombing. She had treated civilians wounded by American shells. She did not forgive these acts. But forgiveness was not the issue. The issue was whether the men guarding them were the monsters she had been taught to expect. Her answer unsettled her. The typists worried about what this realization demanded of them. If the enemy could act with restraint, then surrender had not been shameful in the way they had believed. Survival had not required degradation. This thought collided with everything they had been told about honor. It threatened to undo the meaning they had attached to suffering. One night, as rumors of Japan's impending defeat circulated, the clerk asked what would happen after the war. No one answered. The future felt more uncertain now than it had during combat. Combat had offered clarity. Captivity offered questions. The phrase surfaced again, unprompted. This time it came from the nurse. She said it quietly, almost reluctantly. She said that real men did not need cruelty to prove authority. She said this while staring at the ground. The others did not challenge her. They were careful not to romanticize what they were seeing. They remained prisoners. They remained guarded. Their lives were constrained by decisions made elsewhere. But within those constraints, something fundamental had shifted. Fear no longer defined every interaction. Observation had taken its place. This shift did not resolve the conflict inside them. It sharpened it. They were caught between loyalty to what they had been taught and fidelity to what they had experienced. Choosing one meant betraying the other. For now, they chose silence. As the days passed, the women understood that their private judgment would eventually demand expression. Repatriation would come. Questions would be asked. They would be expected to speak of the enemy in approved terms. The phrase they had shared among themselves would not fit easily into those terms. On the night before their transfer to a new facility, the older woman said one last thing. She said that restraint was only visible when power was present. She said they had seen power restrained. She did not say what that meant for the war they had lost, or for the country they would return to. She let the implications settle, heavy and unresolved, as the women lay awake, knowing that what they now understood could not be unlearned, and that the judgment forming inside them would soon have consequences far beyond the wire. When the war ended in August 1945, the women were no longer simply prisoners. They were reclassified, processed again, and prepared for return to a country that no longer resembled the one they had left. Paperwork replaced guards. Decisions made far above them determined timelines, destinations, and terms of release. Yet the conflict that mattered most was no longer administrative. It was internal. Repatriation did not arrive as relief. It arrived as obligation. The women were expected to resume civilian roles, to speak carefully, and to align their memories with national narratives already forming. Defeat was explained through sacrifice. Suffering was emphasized. Captivity was acknowledged only in general terms. There was little space for nuance and none for contradiction. The phrase they had shared in private did not survive this transition easily. It did not fit the categories offered to them. Public language demanded condemnation or silence. What they carried was neither. It was an observation drawn from lived experience, not ideology. The women understood quickly that repeating it would invite suspicion, not discussion. Some remained silent by choice. Others learned silence through correction. In interviews conducted years later, several Japanese nurses described their captivity in careful terms, focusing on logistics rather than behavior. When pressed, they spoke of rules, of structure, of predictability. They avoided judgment. Avoidance became a strategy for survival in peacetime. Yet the significance of their experience did not disappear. It settled into memory, shaping how they understood authority and power. The older woman returned to a teaching role. She emphasized discipline without brutality. She did not reference Americans. She did not need to. Her students absorbed the lesson without knowing its origin. The clerk married and raised children. She spoke rarely of the war. When she did, she described fear dissolving into uncertainty. She told her children that obedience without accountability was dangerous. They did not ask where she had learned this. They understood that the answer mattered less than the warning. The nurse continued medical work during the occupation. She noticed differences immediately. Oversight, documentation, and standardization were imposed across institutions. She recognized these not as foreign impositions, but as systems she had already encountered in captivity. Recognition carried weight. It confirmed that what she had seen was not an anomaly. Historically, these experiences matter because they expose a fault line in wartime propaganda. Japanese authorities had not simply exaggerated enemy cruelty. They had erased enemy restraint. This erasure was strategic. Fear discouraged surrender. Fear enforced obedience. But fear collapses when confronted by evidence. The women's reactions demonstrate how quickly propaganda loses power when reality intervenes. Their reassessment did not come from persuasion or education. It came from routine, from being counted, from being treated according to rules that applied even when resentment would have justified their absence. This is not a story of moral redemption. Americans acknowledging humane treatment by the enemy complicated victimhood. In the United States, focus rested on victory and reconstruction, not on how restraint functioned under fire. The space for this story narrowed on both sides. Yet archival traces remain. Interviews, diaries, medical reports, small details repeated across accounts. Together, they form a pattern. That pattern shows how rules, when enforced, can interrupt cycles of brutality even in total war. It shows how expectation, when contradicted, forces reassessment. The women did not become advocates. They did not seek to correct history. They lived with a private understanding that altered how they judged authority. That alteration was permanent. It shaped their choices quietly, without declaration. As time passed, memories softened around the edges, but not at the center. The central conflict endured. How to reconcile loyalty to a lost cause with evidence that undermined its claims. How to speak truth without betraying survival. How to live with knowledge that could not be shared freely. This unresolved tension is forces committed acts of destruction across the Pacific. Civilian casualties were real. The women did not forget this. Their judgment was narrower and more precise. It concerned conduct under custody, not the totality of war. That distinction is critical. It reveals how institutions shape behavior independently of individual intent. The restraint the women observed did not depend on personal virtue. It depended on enforcement. Orders were issued. Violations were punished. Accountability was visible. Visibility mattered. In this sense, the phrase real men was not cultural admiration. It was a recognition of control power. The women were not praising the enemy. They were identifying a quality absent from the system that had governed them. That absence had produced chaos, abuse, and fear long before capture. Why then was this perspective overlooked? Gender is part of the answer. Women's wartime experiences were often categorized as secondary. Their captivity stories competed with narratives of combat, heroism, and sacrifice. Subtle observations about discipline did not fit celebratory frameworks. Politics played a role as well. Post-war Japan needed coherence. Acknowledging humane treatment by the enemy complicated victimhood. In the United States, focus rested on victory and reconstruction, not on how restraint functioned under fire. The space for this story narrowed on both sides. Yet archival traces remain. Interviews, diaries, medical reports does not absolve. It clarifies. It shows that even in war, behavior is shaped by systems, and that fear loses its grip fastest when confronted by restraint enforced, not imagined. That is what this story ultimately reveals. Not a reversal of enemies into friends, but the collapse of a certainty built on lies. And in that collapse, the women found themselves changed, holding a judgment formed in silence, still unanswered, and still waiting to be weighed by those willing to hear it. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.